The stone won't fall until the podcast of the dragon comes to your device. Hey everybody, my name is Morgan. Long time, no podcast. Welcome to the 45th episode of Podcast of the Dragon. Moraine Damodred is so stubborn that she could be an honorary Two Rivers woolhead, but she can't out-stubborn the Dragon Reborn. In this episode, I wrap up the fires of heaven by looking at her relationship with Rand al'Thor, how it started, where it could have gone right, what she did wrong, and the drastic steps she takes to fix what can be fixed while she's still on this side of the doorway. Robert Jordan's goal with the Wheel of Time was to explore fantasy through the lens of reality. He did this by giving us a savior who would be dubious about his status of chosen one and very reluctant to take up the role. He did it by giving us nations who would not band together even when faced with apocalypse because they were filled with short-sighted people more concerned with personal interests. Pretty realistic. And he gave us a wise wizard who flipped the trope on its head. Not because she's a woman, but because, unlike so many of the benevolent advisors that guide protagonists through fantasies, in the Wheel of Time, our hero mistrusts her, almost from the first. RJ presents a contentious alliance between Moraine and Rand. Theirs is a relationship built on fear and anxiety and suspicion. And while contention among allies makes for a more interesting narrative exploration, you always get more from the contentious relationships than the supportive ones, because while they don't give you the same amount of warm fuzzies, everybody wants that drama. It takes something away on the back end, because for all that Rand punishes himself when Moraine goes through the doorway, it doesn't have the emotional impact that it could have, because we aren't hit with a sense of grief the way we'd be if he were losing someone he had an established supportive connection with. Rand has mommy issues that Jordan alludes to but never delves into, and he could have developed a truly emotionally devastating relationship that left us all shredded with the sense of Rand's loss when Moraine quote-unquote dies to save him. Instead, RJ uses her death as an opportunity to kickstart Rand into a downward spiral, not from grief, but from self-loathing and blame. And it's not a wrong choice. In fact, it makes sense within the context of their relationship. So while I regret what RJ could have given us, where we could behind Rand's eyes have felt a sense of gut-wrenching loss, I appreciate the reality of the relationship that we get, one that is true to the story, because RJ gives us glimpses throughout of a young man craving warmth and comfort from a mentor he can trust, and feeling anger and betrayal when Moraine doesn't give him what he needs. Jordan gives us a single interaction between Moraine and Rand before Rand loses his innocence. We get Rand for a few short chapters in the Eye of the World where he's mostly untraumatized beyond the scary rider on the road. He's ignorant of Trollocs and Myrdril, not in doubt of his parentage, and blissfully unaware that the enchanting mystery woman who has showed up in the village in time for Beltane is Aes Sedai. RJ sets up the encounter by having Mat and Ewan Fingar tell Rand that there are strangers in the village, and one of them is a high-born lady like no one has ever seen before. And so Rand is stoked, thinking that this is going to be a Beltane unlike any other because there's a gleeman and fireworks and these mysterious strangers. Then a little later, when he and Mat feel the Raven spy on them and start throwing rocks at it, Moraine shows up behind them saying that it's a vile bird and to be mistrusted at the best of times. And here we have, fancier than any feast day clothes, Ewan had said, and he was right. No one ever dressed like that in the Two Rivers. Not ever. "Good morning, Mistress, Lady Moraine," Rand said. His face grew hot at his tongue's fumbling. "Good morning, Lady Moraine," Mat echoed, somewhat more smoothly, but only a little. She smiled, and Rand found himself wondering if there was anything he might do for her, something that would give him an excuse to stay near her. He knew she was smiling at all of them, but it seemed meant for him alone. It really was just like seeing a gleeman's tale come to life. Mat had a foolish grin on his face. "You know my name," she said, sounding delighted, as if her presence, however brief, would not be the talk of the village for a year. But you must call me Moraine, not lady. And what are your names?" Ewan leaped forward before either of the others could speak. "My name is Ewan Fingar, my lady. I told them your name. That's how they know. I heard Land say it, but I wasn't eavesdropping. No one like you has ever come to Emmons Field before. There's a glee man in the village for Beltane, too, and tonight is winter night. Will you come to my house? My mother has apple cakes." "I shall have to see," she replied, putting a hand on Ewan's shoulder. Her eyes twinkled with amusement, though she gave no other sign of it. "I do not know how well I could compete against a glee man, Ewan, but you must all call me Moraine." She looked expectantly at Rand and Matt. "I'm Matt from Cawthon, Moraine," Matt said. He made a stiff, jerking bow, then went red in the face as he straightened. Rand had been wondering if he should do something of the sort, the way men did in the stories, but with Matt's example he merely spoke his name. At least he did not stumble over his own tongue this time. Moraine looked from him to Matt and back again. Rand thought her smile, a bare curve of the corners of her mouth, was now the sort Egwene wore when she had a secret. "I may have some small tasks to be done from time to time while I am in Emmons Field," she said. "Perhaps you would be willing to assist me?" She laughed as their assents tumbled over one another. "Here," she said, and Rand was surprised when she pressed a coin into his palm, closing his hand tightly around it with both of hers. "There's no need," he began, but she waved aside his protest as she gave Ewan a coin as well, then pressed Matt's hand around one the same way she had Rand's. "Of course there is," she said. "You cannot be expected to work for nothing. Consider this a token and keep it with you, so you will remember that you have agreed to come to me when I ask it. There is a bond between us now." "I'll never forget," Ewan piped up. "Later we must talk," she said, "and you must tell me all about yourselves." And so here R.J. shows Rand very charmed by Moraine in his first interaction with her, and inclined to trust her, He sees her, and he wants to find excuses to be near her, and to do her favors with no thought for payment. And in looking at Moraine and Rand's relationship, and how it progresses from this point, I have to think that it was her intention to slowly build trust with the boys, because she didn't know how dire their timeline was. At the point that she is giving them the tracking coins, she doesn't think she has all the time in the world, perhaps, but there's a sense in the way RJ writes the scene that she's planning on being there for a while, and she'll use that time to ease them into trusting her. And she lays the foundation by asking them to periodically spend time with her while she's in town under the guise of helping her, by encouraging them to speak to her very familiarly, using only her first name, by giving them a significant amount of money. Rand thinks to himself that the coin she gives him is enough to buy a good horse in the Two Rivers, so it's almost like she gives them a retainer. And she does it by touching him and Matt very intimately, pressing their hands in both of hers when she gives them the money. And we learn in Book 11 that the weave Moraine uses on the coins is called a finder. Elaine uses one on the cut-purse Samuel Hart before she sends him after David Hanlon, and we're given a bit of information about it in her internal narrative. And it's my personal opinion that the most interesting thing RJ shows us about the weave 10 books later is that Elaine does not touch the cut-purse when she lays it upon him. So the way Moraine chooses to give the coins to the boys, which RJ very deliberately points out, she casually hands a coin to Ewan but clasps Rand and Matt's hands, has nothing to do with magic and everything to do with establishing a sense of connection. And, of course, it does double duty of hiding from Ewan that she only gives him a silver penny, whereas Rand and Matt get silver marks. Moraine has that drug dealer handshake down pat. But the subtext of Moraine and Rand's first meeting is that the Aes Sedai was planning at the start to deal with the boys from a much gentler place. Unfortunately, Ashamael sent Trollocs and Myrdril to crash her party and ruin everything. Moraine was not given the option to let the kids get to know her as a person and trust her before coming out as Aes Sedai. Instead, she was forced to out herself super early to save the village from destruction, and Rand is not in a great headspace when he learns about it, having survived the attack on the farm, dealing with Narg, hearing his father mumble about finding a baby, having Nynaeve saying Tam was dying, etc., etc. Rand had a rough night, and he's gotten his father to the Wine Spring Inn and is in one of the rooms with Tom and Master Alvir, listening to the mayor talk about how that asshole Darrell Copland kept trying to get him to yeet Moraine and Lan from the village when it wouldn't fucking exist anymore without them. It says, Rand had only half listened to the conversation, but this last tugged him to speak. What did they do? Why, she called ball lightning out of the clear night sky, Master Alvir replied. Set it darting straight at the Trollocs. You've seen trees shattered by it. The Trollocs stood it no better." "Moraine," Rand said incredulously, and the mayor nodded. "Mistress Moraine, and Master Lan was a whirlwind with that sword of his. His sword? The man himself is a weapon, and in 10 places at once, or so it seemed. Burn me, but I so wouldn't believe it if I couldn't step outside and see." He rubbed a hand over his bald head. "Winter night visits just beginning, our hands full of presents and honey cakes, and our heads full of wine, then the dogs snarling, and suddenly the two of them burst out of the inn, running through the village, shouting about Trollocs. I thought they'd had too much wine. After all, Trollocs? Then before anyone knew what was happening, those things were right in the streets with us, slashing at people with their swords, torching houses, howling to freeze a man's blood." He made a sound of disgust in his throat. "We just ran like chickens with a fox in the henyard till Master Lan put some backbone into us." "No need to be so hard," Tom said. "You did as well as anyone could. Not every Trolloc lying out there fell to the two of them." Yes, well," Master Alvier gave himself a shake, "it's still almost too much to believe. An Aes Sedai in Emond's Field, and Master Lan is a warder." "An Aes Sedai?" Rand whispered. "She can't be. I talked to her. She isn't. She doesn't." "Did you think they wore signs?" the mayor said wryly. "Aes Sedai painted across their backs, and maybe danger, stay away." Suddenly he slapped his forehead. "Aes Sedai. I'm an old fool and losing my wits. There's a chance, Rand, if you're willing to take it. I can't tell you to do it, and I don't know if I'd have the nerve if it were me." "A chance?" Rand said. "I'll take any chance if it'll help." "Aes Sedai can heal, Rand. Burn me, lad, you've heard the stories. They can cure where medicines fail. Gleeman, you should have remembered that better than I. Gleeman's tales are full of Aes Sedai. Why didn't you speak up instead of letting me flail around?" "I'm a stranger here," Tom said, looking longingly at his unlit pipe. "And Goodman Copland isn't the only one who wants nothing to do with Aes Sedai. Best the idea came from you." "An Aes Sedai," Rand muttered, trying to make the woman who had smiled at him fit the stories. Help from an Aes Sedai was sometimes worse than no help at all, so the stories said, like poison in a pie, and their gifts always had a hook in them, like fish bait. Suddenly the coin in his pocket, the coin Moraine had given him, seemed like a burning coal. It was all he could do not to rip it out of his coat and throw it out the window. "Nobody wants to get involved with Aes Sedai, lad," the mayor said slowly. "It is the only chance I can see, but it's still no small decision. I cannot make it for you, but I have seen nothing but good from Mistress Moraine. Moraine Sedai, I should call her, I suppose. Sometimes," he gave a meaningful look at Tam, "you have to take a chance, even if it's a poor one. Some of the stories are exaggerated, in a way," Tom added, as if the words were being dragged from him. "Some of them. Besides, boy, what choice do you have?" "None," Rand sighed. Tam still had not moved a muscle. His eyes were sunken as if he had been sick a week. I'll go find her." "The other side of the bridges," the Gleeman said, "where they are disposing of the dead Trollocs. But be careful, boy. Aes Sedai do what they do for reasons of their own, and they aren't always the reasons others think." That last was a shout that followed Rand through the door. He had to hold on to the sword hilt to keep the scabbard from tangling in his legs as he ran, but he would not take the time to remove it. He clattered down the stairs and dashed out of the inn, tiredness forgotten for the moment. A chance for Tam, however small, was enough to overcome a night without sleep, for a time at least. That the chance came from an Aes Sedai, or what the price of it might be, he did not want to consider, and as for actually facing an Aes Sedai, he took a deep breath and tried to move faster. And then Rand approaches Moraine and Lan as they're looking over the dead Trollocs, and we get this. Rand stared at her, unable to speak. An Aes Sedai. He had been trying to convince himself that she would not look any different now that he knew what he was looking at, and to his surprise she did not. She was no longer quite so pristine, not with wisps of her hair sticking out in all directions and a faint streak of soot across her nose, yet not really different either. Surely there must be something about an Aes Sedai to mark her out for what she was. On the other hand, if outward appearances reflected what was inside, and if the stories were true, then she should look closer to a Trolloc than to a more than handsome woman whose dignity was not dented by sitting in the dirt, and she could help Tam. Whatever the cost, there was that before anything else. He took a deep breath. "Mistress Moraine Sedai." Both turned to look at him, and he froze under her gaze. Not the calm, smiling gaze he remembered from the green. Her face was tired, but her dark eyes were a hawk's eyes. Aes Sedai, breakers of the world, Puppeteers who pulled strings and made thrones and nations dance in designs only the women from Tarvalon knew. And Moraine's response to seeing Rand is undoubtedly an internal rush of relief, but what she says is simply that there's a little more light in the darkness. Moraine is too good at compartmentalizing to be internally freaking out, but she has to have had a quiet alarm going off because she doesn't yet know if the third boy is alive. And when Rand asks her to heal his dad, she immediately agrees to do so, which she would of course do for anybody, but it's especially important here because doing him this favor is another way to establish trust. Unfortunately for her, Rand fears and mistrusts Aes Sedai and everything to do with the One Power, and the Trollocs are coming back, so she no longer has time for finesse. In a sense, the first book shows us a relationship that could have been strong and trusting if not for circumstance. If she had had the time, if there hadn't been external dangers and traumas, if she had not felt compelled to threaten them to ensure they didn't wander off, if she hadn't had to sink the ferry to keep them safe, something that Rand, who in the early books has too much emotion, too little logic, and not enough nuance, can only see as capital W wrong, if, and post-Shatter Logoth, RJ shows that Rand has softened toward Moraine, starting the moment they get separated leaving the city, where he suddenly finds himself missing her very much. He trusts her enough to keep heading for Caemlyn and then Tarvalon, despite the counter-influence of another mentor, Tom Merrilin, trying to get him to stay on the Spray and head for Ilion. When he's waking up at the inn in Market Sharon before Pater the Darkfriend ruins their breakfast, he's feeling positive, because Matt's sight is returning, and they slept warm and had a whole 24 hours of no Darkfriend fuckery, and he thinks that when he sees Moraine he'll kiss her because he's excited to be able to reconnect with her and have someone else be in charge, because he'd rather have the Aes Sedai be in charge than have to keep making these grown-up decisions. I think it's safe to say that between Shatter Logoth and when he learns he can channel, Rand has some trust for Moraine. If Book 1 shows us a relationship that could have been strong and trusting if not for circumstance, Book 2 shows us a relationship that could have been strong and trusting if not for bad decisions. And I explored this a good bit in episodes 10 and 11, because Rand is desperate for information and assurance, and he wants Moraine to soften the blow of what he learned about himself at the Eye of the World. We get shown this right away in Chapter 1 of Book 2, with Rand and Lan sword fighting on the tower top. Lan is probing, and he's asking him, "Why the fuck are you still here?" And Rand more or less says, "Mat, Perrin, Nynaeve, and Egwene are still here," and he says some other stuff, the subtext of which is, he's a man who can channel, and his future is grim, and everything's confusing, and he's having a hard time accepting it. And you get, "And that is all the reason? You want to spend as much time as you can with your friends from home before they go? That's why you're dragging your feet? You know what's sniffing at your heels." Rand surged angrily to his feet. "All right, it's Moraine. I wouldn't even be here if not for her, and she won't as much as talk to me." "You'd be dead if not for her, sheepherder," Lan said flatly, but Rand rushed on. She tells me horrible things about myself." His knuckles whitened on the sword. "That I'm going to go mad and die. And then suddenly she won't even say 2 words to me. She acts as if I'm no different than the day she found me, and that smells wrong too." "You want her to treat you like what you are?" "No, I don't mean that. Burn me, I don't know what I mean half the time. I don't want that, and I'm scared of the other. Now she's gone off somewhere, vanished. I told you she needs to be alone sometimes. It isn't for you or anyone else to question her actions. Without telling anybody where she was going or when she'd be back, or even if she would be back. She has to be able to tell me something to help me, Lan. Something. She has to. If she ever comes back." "She's back, sheepherder. Last night. But I think she has told you all she can. Be satisfied. You've learned what you can from her." So, I don't think that Moraine specifically told Rand horrible things. I highly doubt that when he learned he could channel, she said to him, "So, Rand, you're going to go insane and die horribly." It's just that Rand is putting the responsibility for what he learned about himself at the Eye, that he can channel, and his knowledge of all the fuckery that entails, on Moraine's shoulders. He knows what happens to male channelers, and because Moraine acknowledged the truth that he is a male channeler, he's kind of making that her fault, because they learned this thing together, this thing that has such tragic consequences. And the opportunity for trust is there, because he's taken the fact that she's not trying to hurt or gentle him on good enough faith that he's willing to go to her for help, And instead of opening the door and actually building a strong and trusting relationship with him, Moraine destroys any chance of it by refusing to engage with him. I made my feelings clear in discussing Rand and Moraine's relationship in episodes 10 and 11, and I acknowledged that while Moraine chose a terrible way of dealing with him, all of her options were bad, and however much Rand fears and mistrusts her, it's nothing to how much she fears and mistrusts him. Everything rides on this kid not fucking up, and she has very little in her control, is likely constantly worrying about the potential influence of evil on him, worrying about his sanity, that he might go too crazy before he can fight the last battle, that he'll wreak destruction and break the world, and all of her wrestling to control him won't be enough to mitigate it, none of which makes the way that she treats him okay, and it destroys the easiest path to the position of trusted advisor she aspires to, the one, preferably the only one, the dragon confides in. If Moraine had just given him someone he could talk to about being a male channeler, someone who would look at him and not flinch, he would have kept coming back to her. All he needed was a shoulder to cry on. If RJ had had Moraine learn at the start of Book 2 that Rand al'Thor responds to kindness, patience, and openness, and listening to him and straightforwardly answering his questions, including saying straight out, "Under the light and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I do not want to use you as a false dragon, nor to make you a puppet of Tar-Valon." If RJ had done that, he could have given us a relationship between these two that would absolutely destroy us when Moraine tackles Lanfear through the doorway. And I kinda hate him that he didn't. Every time Rand and Moraine interact, I kinda hate him for it. And at the same time, what we get instead is so fucking realistic. Human bonds are so fragile sometimes. Even ones that are almost impossible to break can be damaged so that they barely function, and sometimes it doesn't take much. But in Rand and Moraine's case, it takes a good bit. RJ has Moraine freeze Rand out, and when she finally does engage with him, it's to shittily bushwhack him with Swan and Varen to tell him he's the dragon. Then she pulls the bullshit with his coats. She has his plain coats packed up so he's forced to travel in the finery he wore to visit the Amyrlin, and it turns out the other coats she had packed for him were just as fancy, and even with all of that, Rand's craving for her counsel hasn't been beaten out of him yet. The hunters for the horn cross the Aranon and come upon the village with the Fade nailed to the door, and Rand gets trapped in the weird time loop with the flies, and further on they make camp in the hollow with the portal stone. And Rand is stopped with one foot still in the stirrup. He's staring into space mid-dismount, and we get even more than the Fade nailed to the door. He wanted to forget that room and the flies and the people who were there and not there. The half-men had been real. Everybody had seen that. But the room... Maybe I'm finally going mad. He wished Moraine was there to talk to. Wishing for an Aes Sedai. You are a fool. You're well out of that. Now stay out. But am I out? What happened there? Even with all she's done, his instinct is to want to talk to her because he's upset and confused. But then Ingtar comes and gives Rand a special package wrapped just for him by Moraine, a package that contains the dragon banner, and he tells him she said that his life might depend upon it, and at the same time tells him that he is the second in command of the soldiers. Mat and Perrin follow him when he goes off into the bushes to unwrap the banner, and subsequently learn that he can channel, and later that night he's kidnapped by Lanfear and brought into the mirror world, and after that, when Rand thinks of Moraine, it's to wonder if she really let him go, but he doesn't want to talk to her anymore. Along with the wise wizard trope, Moraine could be said to embody another trope and turn it on its head, that of the wicked stepmother. Only it's realistic, so it's the asshole stepmother instead. She's not wicked, but might as well be for all the damage she does. She takes a sudden, invasive, authoritative place in a teenager's life and does every last thing wrong to ensure he will always be guarded toward her, and she presumes to think she can dictate the tone of their relationship, and that she has a right to confidences she hasn't earned. She had a window in which to secure trust and affection, and she didn't just miss it, she destroyed it. Despite his ambivalence about her, Rand wants a relationship, and the relationship that he wants is rejected. and that hurts and angers him so much that by the end of book 2 he argues that he neither needs nor wants her because she wasn't there when he did need and want her. It's almost like Moraine froze Rand out until she anticipated that he would for sure need her, i.e. once he declares himself the dragon. That was the plan, before the Trollocs and Dark Friends raided Valdara Keep and stole the Horn of Valir. Moraine originally tells Swan that the three boys will carry the horn to Ilion. She's got some shit she has to do, and once they reach Ilion, she'll be there at Rand's side when he presents the horn to the king and the Council of Nine, and in so doing she'll take her place as his advisor and confidant. But until then, she keeps him at arm's length, acting disinterested so as not to scare him away, too stupid when it comes to human relationships to see that if instead of just waiting to show up until Rand needed her, she had actually showed up for him earlier when he wanted her, her life over the next few books would be a lot easier. In Book 3, Rand has raised the banner. He needs Moraine more than ever, so she said at the end of Book 2, and we know Aes Sedai cannot lie, and she's done freezing him out. And if I had to guess, I'd say the relationship she'd like to be having with Rand ideally would be one of regency, where she makes all the decisions and Rand listens and learns. And I'm guessing that's what RJ doesn't show us when we hear in Perrin's POV that they have been arguing all winter. We don't see her trying to force an authoritative relationship like a presumptuous stepmother who blew her shot at establishing trust, and Rand rebuffing it, and only doing what she says because he knows she's right, but fighting her anyway because he's full of stress and rage and having serious mental health issues, and Moraine's fair game because she's got asshole stepmother energy and is always on his case, and then he finally dips because he's done fighting with her. He's done with her trying to dictate the terms of their relationship. And also because he's got dreams of Calendor, because something has to get him to tear. RJ sets up Moraine's oath to Rand in the Shadow Rising. By Book 4, Rand is freezing her out. Now he's in a place to make decisions that have political consequences, and he's refusing to run them by her and refusing to share plans. They are butting heads as she pushes him to take some action, because sitting there letting the Terrans grow used to him is dangerous, and he's refusing to be pushed or to take her suggestions, because she thinks his next move should be to invade Ilion. He's making her wait, along with everyone else, to even hear what his next move is going to be, because he's not interested in her trying to derail his plans. And I discussed in episode 29, To Hold Their Hearts, something of the state of his struggles with Moraine. Theirs is officially a contentious relationship, and Rand immediately questions anything that she says or does, and especially anything she asks of him, even as he's bleeding out, post-Bubble of Evil, when she comes in to heal him and says, assuming that he hurt himself channeling, "At least you are alive." Her voice was musical, a chill, angry music at the moment. "What happened can wait. Try to touch the true source." "Why?" Rand asked in a wary voice. "I cannot heal myself, even if I knew how to heal. No one can. I know that much." For the space of a breath, Moraine seemed on the point of an outburst, strange as that would have been, but in another breath she was once again layered in calm so deep that surely nothing could crack it. "Only some of the strength for healing comes from the healer. The power can replace what comes from the healed. Without it you will spend tomorrow flat on your back and perhaps the next day as well. Now draw on the power if you can, but do nothing with it. Simply hold it. Use this if you must." She did not have to bend far to touch Calendor. Rand moved the sword from under her hand. "Simply hold it, you say?" He sounded about to laugh out loud. "Very well." Nothing happened that Perrin could see, not that he expected to. Rand sat there looking like the survivor of a lost battle, looking at Moraine. She hardly blinked. Twice she scrubbed her fingers against her palms as if unaware. After a time, Rand sighed. "I cannot even reach the void. I can't seem to concentrate." A quick grin cracked the blood drying on his face. "I do not understand why." A thick red thread snaked its way down past his left eye. "Then I will do it as I always have," Moraine said, and took Rand's head in her hands, careless of the blood that ran over her fingers. Rand lurched to his feet with a roaring gasp, as if all the breath were being squeezed from his lungs, his back arching so his head nearly tore free of her grasp, one arm flung wide, fingers spread and bending back so far it seemed they must break, the other hand clamped down on Calendor's hilt, the muscles of that arm knotting visibly into cramps. He shook like cloth caught in a windstorm. Dark flakes of dried blood fell, and bits of glass tinkled onto the chest and floor, forced out of cuts closing themselves up and knitting themselves together. And a bit further it says, almost as soon as it began, it was done. Moraine took her hands away, and Rand slumped, catching the bedpost to hold himself on his feet. It was difficult to say whether he clutched the bedpost or Callandor more tenaciously. When Moraine tried to take the sword to replace it on the ornate stand against the wall, he drew it away from her firmly, even roughly. Her mouth tightened momentarily, but she contented herself with pulling the wad of cloth from his side, using it to scrub away some of the surrounding smears. The old wound was a tender scar again. The other injuries were simply gone. The mostly dried blood that still covered him could have come from someone else. Moraine frowned. "It still does not respond," she murmured half to herself. "It will not heal completely." "That is the one that will kill me, isn't it?" he asked her softly, then quoted, "His blood on the rocks of Shale Ghul, washing away the shadow, sacrifice for man's salvation." "You read too much," she said sharply, "and understand too little." "Do you understand more? If you do, then tell me." "He is only trying to find his way," Lan said suddenly. "No man likes to run forward blindly when he knows there is a cliff somewhere ahead." Perrin gave a twitch of surprise. Lan almost never disagreed with Moraine, or at least not where anyone could overhear. He and Rand had been spending a good deal of time together, though, practicing the sword. Moraine's dark eyes flashed, but what she said was, "He needs to be in bed. Will you ask that wash water be brought and another bedchamber prepared? This one needs a thorough cleaning and a new mattress." Lan nodded and put his head into the anteroom for a moment, speaking quietly. "I will sleep here, Moraine." Letting go of the bedpost, Rand pushed himself erect, grounding Callandor's point on the littered carpet and resting both hands on the hilt. If he leaned a little on the sword, it did not show much. "I won't be chased any more, not even out of a bed." "Tai Shar Manetheren," Lan murmured. This time even Rourke looked startled, but if Moraine heard the warder compliment Rand, she gave no sign of it. She was staring at Rand, her face smooth but thunderheads in her eyes. Rand wore a quizzical little smile, as if wondering what she would try next. So Rand earns Lan's respect here. He's not being childish in this moment. He's just refusing to be instructed, or pushed, or patronized. He's not going to let her take his sword from him and put it away. He's not going to let her tell him that he needs to go anywhere or do anything. He's going to ask questions. "You want me to do this thing? Why? Explain it to me, and if there's a good reason, I'll do it. But don't just give me instructions. Don't just dictate to me. That's not our relationship here. This is not how it's going to be anymore." And she's just boiling inside because she's not prepared yet to accept that things are going to happen on his terms. A couple of chapters later, we watch through Elaine's eyes as Moraine has an outburst where she more or less tells the Supergirls Rand al'Thor is a giant fucking asshole. And her emotions being riled is presumably explanation enough for how unusually forthcoming Moraine is with the girls in the scene. She's very open about the level of desperation that Rand's stubbornness is pushing her to, and what she might feel pressed to do, telling them all about the doorframe ter'angreal, including the rules for using it. And that's something I've always wavered over whether or not I think it's a mischaracterization, however necessary for plot purposes. But RJ does write Moraine's character as a person who tumbles down the scree slope of serenity about halfway through Book 3. From the midpoint of The Dragon Reborn on, Moraine gives the impression of a woman on the edge. And perhaps she vents to the girls because the person she would normally vent to, her confidant of 20 years, well, 20 minutes ago he stood up against her and in defense of that antagonistic shithead Rand al'Thor. Moraine isn't just forthcoming with the girls about that redstone doorway and the great holding of the stone. RJ has her explain to them her reasoning behind wanting Rand's next step to be a war with Ilion. She feels it's a politically solid next move because the Terrans will be totally down to do it, and once he's become their battle leader in a fight against their ancient enemy, they'll be committed to him, and when he eventually wins, the Ilioners will follow him too. And so she's explaining to the girls about why she wants him to attack Samael/Ilion and complaining about what he's chosen to do instead. It says, "He has decided to find out for himself what the prophecies of the dragon say." Moraine's face remained cool and smooth, but suddenly she sounded almost as tired as Elaine felt. They may have been prescribed in Tyr, but the chief librarian had 9 different translations in a locked chest. Rand has them all now. I pointed out the verse that applies here, and he quoted it to me from an old Kandori translation. Power of the shadow made human flesh, wakened to turmoil, strife, and ruin. The reborn one, marked and bleeding, dances the sword in dreams and mist, chains the shadow-sworn to his will. From the city, lost and forsaken, leads the spears to war once more, breaks the spears and makes them see truth long hidden in the ancient dream. She grimaced. It applies to this as well as it does to anything. Ilion under Samael is surely a forsaken city. Lead the Terran spears to war, chain Samael, and he has fulfilled the verse, the ancient dream of the dragon reborn. But he will not see it. He even has a copy in the old tongue, as if he understood 2 words. He runs after shadows, and Samael or Ravin or Lanfear may have him by the throat before I can convince him of his mistake. And let me just say how much it drives me nuts every single time I read this perspective that RJ never once has Elaine think about the fact that Moraine is her aunt. She has to know. What a perfect opportunity for Elaine to have opinions. Anyway, Moraine snatches this verse from the prophecies, thinking that she could use it to strengthen her position that Rand should take the Terrans and attack Samael and Ilion, and Rand just grabs it from her and rattles it off like, I know this poem better than you do, and it's not going to convince me to do what you want. Rand al'Thor does not start wars on a whim. Once they get to the waste, Rand isn't just freezing Moraine out, he's growing more and more suspicious of her. When he and Matt return from Rhuidean at dawn, they're pretty badly injured because a bubble of evil called up dust monsters that attacked them as they were leaving the city. They return to the Wise Ones on Chaindair, looking forward to being healed, and let down when they learn that Moraine also went into Rhuidean, and the Wise Ones don't have Aes Sedai healing. It says, Matt and he would have to wait for more rain. If she had not been killed by that bubble of evil, by those dust creatures, it must have dissipated by now. There had been an end to the one in Tyr. They wouldn't have stopped her. She could channel her way through them. She knows what she's doing. She doesn't have to figure it out an inch at a time the way I do. But then why was she not back? Why had she gone in the first place, and why had he not seen her? Foolish question. 100 people could have been in Rhuidean without being seen. Too many questions, and no answers until she did return, he suspected. If then... There are herbs and ointments, Siana said. Come out of the sun, and we will tend your injuries. Out of the sun, Rand muttered. Yes. He was being boorish, but he did not care. Why had Moraine gone into Rhuidean? He did not trust her to stop pushing him in the direction she thought best, and the Dark One take his opinions. If she was in there, could she have affected what he saw? Changed it some way? If she even suspected what he planned. So there's a lot of paranoia and suspicion here, and a little later he asks Rourke if everyone sees the same things in the columns. And while he likely would have asked that question regardless, wondering if Moraine had meddled with the ter'angreal gives him extra motivation. Yet, even with all this, and RJ has him almost belligerent in his frustration, most of which is fueled by having to wait up to 3 more days for Moraine and Aviendha to come back. Even with all that, Rand doesn't entertain even the slightest, fleeting, most wistful thought of leaving Moraine behind. Jordan says a great deal about a complicated relationship by having Rand not even joke to himself about it. It doesn't even cross his mind. RJ does not have Rand and Moraine interact a whole lot as they journey through the waste. I think he does this partly because he has a lot of balls in the air and can't put much more energy into their relationship in the Shadow Rising, and partly because whatever energy he does put into their relationship will need to move it quickly towards the crisis of her oath, because she returns from Rhuidean knowing that she's on borrowed time, and with where they are before they go to Rhuidean, there are only so many meaningful interactions he can sketch between them before something has to give. The next significant moment between them is when they get to Cold Rock's hold, and they go beneath Leon's roof. They are having the amusing dinner where Aviendha is basically tormenting him by being an asshole as she teaches him dinner etiquette, and the discussion surrounds how they're going to get all of the clans to come to Alcair Dal. That it's going to take about a month, and the Dreamwalkers are going to have to speak to the Wise Ones of all the other clans in their dreams to get them all to come. And Rourke says something to the effect of, most of the Aiel will follow him, and perhaps all, but the question is how will they react when they see him with his dragons? And Rourke wonders if he might change his mind and put on Cadden's sword. And it says, "And show them what, Rourke? A pretend Aiel? As we'll dress Mat for Aiel." Mat choked on his pipe. "I will not pretend. I am what I am. They must take me as I am." Rand raised his fists, coat sleeves falling enough to uncover the golden-maned heads on the backs of his wrists. "These prove me. If they aren't enough, then nothing is." "Where do you mean to lead the spears to war once more?" Moraine asked suddenly, and Mat choked again, snatching the pipe out of his mouth and staring at her. Her dark eyes were not lidded any longer. Rand's fist tightened convulsively till his knuckles cracked. Trying to be clever with her was dangerous. He should have learned that long since. She remembered every word that she heard, filed it away, sorted and examined until she knew just what it meant. So Rand is super upset that she didn't just forget about that prophecy that she tried to use to guide him into attacking Ilian and Samael, which, duh, of course she didn't. She knew that if it was important enough for him to memorize, he had to be considering where it applied. And since it was his chosen destination, Rhuidean was obviously actually the city lost and forsaken, and having her figure anything out when he's determined to leave her out in the cold upsets him so much that he leaves to go for a walk. And the chapter ends, and the next chapter starts, and it says, outside on the stone-paved path between the yellow brick house and the terraced vegetable garden, Rand stood staring down the canyon, not seeing much beyond afternoon shadows creeping across the canyon floor. If only he could trust Moraine not to hand him to the tower on a leash. He had no doubt she could do it, without using the power once if he gave her an inch. The woman could manipulate a bull through a mouse hole without ever letting it know. He could use her. Light, I'm as bad as she is. Use the Aiel. Use Moraine. If only I could trust her. Which is fair to be super frustrated about it, because she's obviously someone who would be very useful as an ally, a very useful advisor, which is what she wants to be all along. But because she's approaching this from the wrong perspective, because she hasn't yet figured out how to get him to trust her, he won't work with her. But he would be willing to, he just has conditions, which we learn later on that night after Trollocs attack the entrance to Cold Rock's hold as a distraction so that Drakkar can go for Rand. We're in Mat's POV as he's observing everything after the attack, and it says, "Rand," a hurrying shadow called with Moraine's voice, nearly as melodious as Keely's, but a cool music. Rand turned, waiting, and she slowed before she could be seen clearly, entering the light regally enough for any palace. "Matters grow more dangerous, Rand. The attack at Imre's stand could have been aimed at the Aiel. Not likely, yet it could have been. But tonight the Drakkar was surely aimed at you." "I know." Just like that, as calm as she and even colder. Moraine's lips compressed and her hands were too still on her skirts. She was not best pleased. "Prophecy is the most dangerous when you try to make it happen. Did you not learn that in Tyr? The pattern weaves itself around you, but when you try to weave it, even you cannot hold it. Force the pattern too tight and pressure builds. It can explode wildly in every direction. Who can say how long before it settles to focus on you again, or what will happen before it does?" "As clear as most of your explanations," Rand said dryly. "What do you want, Moraine? It is late and I am tired." "I want you to confide in me. Do you think you have already learned all there is to know, little more than a year out of your village?" "No, I haven't learned everything yet." Now he sounded amused. Sometimes Mat was not sure he was still as sane as he looked. "You want me to confide in you, Moraine? All right. Your 3 oaths won't let you lie. Say plainly that whatever I tell you, you won't try to stop me, won't hinder me in any way. Say you won't try to use me for the tower's ends. Say it plain and straight so I know it's true." "I will do nothing to hinder you fulfilling your destiny. I've devoted my life to that, but I will not promise to watch while you lay your head on a chopping block." "Not good enough, Moraine. Not good enough. But if I could confide in you, I'd still not do it here. The night has ears. There were people moving all around in the darkness, but none close enough to hear. Even dreams have ears." So the last really significant interaction between them in the Shadow Rising is Rand asking for an oath. And he's not asking for an oath of obedience. He just wants a promise that will bind her because of the 3 oaths to not get in his way. Don't try to use me. Don't get in my way and say things plainly to me so I know that I can trust you. And then, yeah, I'll confide in you for sure. Let's put our cards on the table and I will tell you things and you can give me your advice and I'll make use of you and we can actually work together. But if you're not going to do that, why would I trust you? And so that's basically it as far as their interactions in Book 4, except for him refusing her very strong suggestion to take Lan with him into Alcair Dal. We leave them on a note of paranoia and suspicion, and what almost feels like mocking or insolence or a lack of respect. So when we next see Rand and Moiraine, it's in Rhuidean, in Chapter 2 of The Fires of Heaven. A month has passed. Rand has grown more belligerent, and Moiraine, who has lost a month of her precious borrowed time, has become more frustrated and more desperate. Chapter 2 starts out with Rand staring out the window into the plaza, watching Moiraine as she's making Hadnan Kadir and his drivers load his wagons with objects of the power. And RJ gives us a bit of foreshadowing by having one of Kadir's men fall halfway through the doorway and needing Lan to grab him by the belt and yank him back out. And then Rand goes back to his meeting with the Aiel clan chiefs, and then as it's winding down, we get... From the corner of his eye, Rand saw 2 women standing expectantly just inside the tall arched doorway. Someone had hung strings of colored beads there, red and blue, to replace the missing doors. One of the women was Moiraine. For a moment he considered making them wait. Moiraine had that irritatingly commanding look on her face, clearly expecting them to break off everything for her. Only there was really nothing left to discuss, and he could tell from the men's eyes that they did not want to make conversation. And a little bit further it says, the chiefs filed out past the 2 women, eyeing Moiraine respectfully. There was nothing of fear in them. Rand wished he could be as sure of himself. Moiraine had too many plans for him, too many ways of pulling strings he did not know she had tied to him. So RJ makes it clear in this quote that Rand is very tense, and in saying that the chiefs don't have any fear of the Aes Sedai, they're just respectful, and it's not so certain with him. He's telling us that Rand is still a little bit afraid of her, and on guard, and not looking forward to interacting with her. So we're prepared for contention even before she opens her mouth. It says, the wagons will be ready to leave for Tar Valon soon, Moiraine said. Her voice was musical, crystalline. Send a strong guard, Rand said, or Kadir may not take them where you want. He turned for the windows again, wanting to look out and think about Kadir. You've not needed me to hold your hand or give you permission before. Abruptly something seemed to strike him across the shoulders, for all the world like a thick hickory stick. Only the slight feel of goosebumps on his skin, not likely in this heat, told him that one of the women had channeled. And a bit further, he filled himself with the power, and he could not tell which woman had done it. They both looked at him as if butter would not melt on their mouths, each with an eyebrow arched almost identically in slightly amused questioning. Either or both could be embracing the female half of the source right that instant, and he would never know. Of course, a stick across the shoulders was not Moraine's way. She found other means of chastising, more subtle, usually more painful in the end, yet even sure that it must have been Egwene, he did nothing. Proof. Thought slid along the outside of the void. He floated within, in emptiness, thought and emotion, even his anger distant. I will do nothing without proof. I will not be goaded this time. She was not the Egwene he had grown up with. She had become part of the tower since Moiraine sent her there. Moiraine again. Always Moiraine. Sometimes he wished he were rid of Moiraine. Only sometimes. Later in the chapter, after Moiraine leaves, Egwene reads him the riot act for acting like an arrogant dickhead, and it says, "So it was you," he snapped, but to his surprise she half shook her head before catching herself. It had been Moiraine after all. If the Aes Sedai was showing that much temper, something must be wearing at her terribly. Him, no doubt. Perhaps he should apologize. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to be civil. Though he could not see why he was supposed to be mannerly to the Aes Sedai while she tried to lead him on a leash. Which is perfectly fair. No one should have to be polite to someone who is trying to manipulate them. But beyond impolite, he's being inflammatory and antagonistic, and while I don't exactly judge him for it, it's not helping things. And of course something is wearing on Moiraine terribly. Many things are wearing on her, perhaps most of all Rand's oppositional defiance. She didn't really come to tell him, hey, the wagons will be ready to go to Tarvalon soon. What she has to impart to him is far more dire, and so she requests that Rand make Asmodean, who is strumming his harp in the corner, fuck off. And Rand refuses, because he basically refuses to do anything she suggests. Anything she asks of him, he wants to question. Anything that she requests, he wants to deny. If there's even the slightest hint that it might be an order or instruction, he's immediately like, no, you're not getting that. Which, again, I sympathize with. It's almost like he's conditioning her at this point. You push too long, you push too much, and now you're not getting anything that you want. And I don't know if Moraine is aware yet that Jason Natale is a Forsaken, but I would guess yes. I would guess that the minute he and Rand started spending a lot of time together, she probably did a little spying and discovered it, and once she reassured herself that Rand having an evil bard/instructor does not mean Rand is slipping into evil himself, but rather that he's clever enough to capture an enemy and force him to be a teacher, I bet she was proud. But she does not want a Forsaken to see as she shaves a piece off of one of the Quaindiar seals, because a lieutenant or a lieutenant of the Dark One, however trapped and weakened, is the last person who should know that a clumsy asshole could oops our way to Tarmangaiden by accidentally dropping the seals. But Rand refuses to make Asmodean fuck off, and she chooses not to fight about it and shaves away. Rand is so shocked by the fact that the Quaindiar is no longer being Quaindiar-y that he stops being a dick and just asks her, how? And she's like, shrug, maybe I'll figure it out on the way to Tarvalon. And it says, you intend to go yourself? He had thought she meant to stick to him like moss to a rock. Isn't this what you want? Eventually, Moraine replied quietly. Eventually I will have to leave you, after all. What will be, must be. Rand thought she shivered, but it was so quick it could have been his imagination, and the next instant she was all composure and self-control once more. You must be ready. The reminder of his doubts came unpleasantly. We should discuss your plans. You cannot sit here much longer. Even if the Forsaken are not planning to come after you, they are out there spreading their power. Gathering the Aiel will do no good if you find that everything beyond the spine of the world is in their hands. Chuckling, Rand leaned back against the table. So this was just another ploy. If he was anxious about her leaving, perhaps he would be more willing to listen, more amenable to being guided. She could not lie, of course, not right out. One of the vaunted 3 oaths took care of that, to speak no word that was not true. He had learned that it left a barn width of wriggle room. She would leave him alone eventually, after he was dead, no doubt. You want to discuss my plans, he said dryly. Pulling a short-stemmed pipe and a leather tobacco pouch from his coat pocket, he thumbed the bowl full, and briefly touched Sidene to channel a flame dancing above the tobacco. Why? They are my plans. Puffing slowly, he waited, ignoring Egwene's glower. And so they get into a contentious back and forth, where she tells him, when you don't take my advice, you fuck up and destroy things. And he's so sensy and defensive about that he ends up telling her his plans, which is to bring the Aiel across the Dragon Wall and use them to make the nations behave and work together. And she says that it's a fucking terrible idea, and it'll ruin all of Swan's work, because had she not been deposed, she'd have been approaching all the nations and getting them prepared for him. And it says... Rand laughed out loud. It was a bitter laugh. Sticking his pipe between his teeth, he hoisted himself to sit cross-legged atop the table, staring at them. So you and Swan Sanche still think you know everything there is to know. The light willing they did not know near everything about him and would never find out. You're both fools. Show some respect, Egwene growled, but Rand went on over her words. The Terran High Lords know the prophecies too, and they knew me once they saw the sword that cannot be touched clutched in my fist. Half of them expect me to bring them power or glory or both. The other half would as soon slip a knife in my back and try to forget the Dragon Reborn was ever in Tyr. That is how the nations will greet the Dragon Reborn, unless I quell them first, the same way I did the Terrans. Do you know why I left Kalendor and Tyr? To remind them of me. Every day they know it is there, driven into the heart of the stone, and they know I'll come back for it. That is what holds them to me. That was one reason he had left the sword that is not a sword behind. He did not like even to think of the other. Be very careful, Moraine said after a moment. Just that, in a voice all frozen calm. He heard stark warning in the words. Once he had heard her say in much the same tone that she would see him dead before letting the shadow have him. A hard woman. For a long moment she gazed at him, her eyes dark pools that threatened to swallow him. Then she made a perfect curtsy. "By your leave, my Lord Dragon, I will see to letting Master Kadir know where I expect him to work tomorrow." No one could have seen or heard the faintest mockery in action or words, but Rand felt it. Anything that might put him off balance, make him more biddable by guilt or shame or uncertainty or whatever, she would try. I wish that RJ had made things more ambiguous. And by that I mean make Moraine not so obviously wrong when it comes to her telling Rand, "Hey, this is a bad idea. You shouldn't have done that thing. You definitely shouldn't do this thing." And it turns out that she's so absolutely wrong. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth in a way that I know it wouldn't if our stubborn wise wizard who was so convinced of her correctness were a man. Probably because however much he wanted to subvert tropes and create a fantasy universe where things are equal, alas, everything we live and breathe and everything RJ wrote is rooted in patriarchy. So it feels gross that when Moraine is the most insistent, she's the most wrong. Though I suppose it's also believable considering how many smart people can be incredibly stupid and how often folks are prone to double down on dumbassery. I honestly think a big part of Moraine's problem is that she was not trained as a Grey, because Greys work as advisors, but they don't give orders to rulers, and in fact they take them. At least they take them if they want to keep their job. But Moraine did not approach the idea of being the Dragon Reborn's advisor from the position of a Grey. She made it up as she went along, and had 18 years to tell herself how it was all going to be. She had all of those years to make plans for things that can't be planned for, to pore over the prophecies and become more convinced in her interpretations. So while it makes sense that she'd be so entrenched that they get driven to a point where something's gotta give, I'd really appreciate it if there were some glaring examples where she's right and Rand's wrong. Though, I suppose Bale firing Baelo might count, since Rand definitely wasn't ready to go for Callandor, and she did argue him out of going down to the Dragonsworn on Almouth Plains, so I suppose that might count. And she definitely spent the whole first book struggling to convince him that leaving with her and doing exactly what she says is the best way to stay alive. So maybe Moraine just has the misfortune of when she's right, it goes unnoticed. Perhaps because she's supposed to be right, and it's the natural order of things, which makes when she's wrong so glaringly apparent. Also because there's so much conflict when she's wrong. Rand won't give, and she's like a dog with a rope or something, and she just won't let it go. Speaking of dogs, the next time Rand interacts with Moraine, after she mockingly curtsies and leaves, is after he awakens to the feel of evil later that night and leads the Darkhounds to the top floor of the Roof of the Maidens, where he tries to kill them with his fire sword only to find out that they melt into pools and reform, so he balefires them to kill them much more thoroughly. It says, "He let go of the thing he had made with a grim smile. A purple bar of light still seemed to cross his vision in afterimage. Across the great chamber a piece of one of the columns crashed to the floor tiles. Where that bar of light, or whatever it had been, not light exactly, had swung, neat slices were gone from the columns. A gaping swath cut half the width of the wall behind them. Did any of them bite you or bleed on you?" He spun at the sound of Moraine's voice. Absorbed in what he had done, he had not heard her come up the stairs. She stood clutching her skirts with both hands, peering at him, face lost in moonshadow. She would have sensed the things the same way he did, but to be here so quickly she must have run. "The maidens let you pass? Have you become Fardarais my, Moraine?" "They grant me some privileges of a wise one," she said in a rush, impatience raw in her usually melodious voice. "I told the guards I had to speak with you urgently. Now answer me! Did the Darkhounds bite you or bleed on you? Did their saliva touch you?" And he tells her no, and is like, "What's the big deal? You could heal it." And she tells him, "Actually, no, I couldn't, because they're chock full of evil toxins and incredibly fucking deadly. And also we need to talk about that shining bar of annihilation you used to kill them." But in the midst of her explanation about the Darkhounds and their deadly bites and evil toxins, she happens to mention that they usually run in larger packs. And since only 3 attacked him, he's sort of like, huh. I'm not the only one that Forsaken regularly try to kill, and so he ditches her and runs across Rodian to Matt, who is also under attack, struggling to hold a chewed door shut and covered in toxic slobber. Rand balefires more Darkhounds, and in doing so he saves Matt's life, because the shining bar of annihilation burns the Darkhound out of existence before it slobbers more than a couple of drops on Matt's arm, way less than Matt remembers it doing. Moraine is able to heal him, and in this scene we get to see the Foxhead working for the first time, where she tries to heal him and Matt's like, the thing's cold as ice all of a sudden, and Moraine is staring at him in shock, but totally keeps her cool and says, well, if it's cold, take it off. So she heals him, and then the party breaks up. The maidens all head back toward the roof of the maidens, and then it says, I must speak with you about, Moraine began. We can talk tomorrow, Rand said, cutting her off. Lan's face hardened further, if such was possible. Warders were far more protective of their Aes Sedai, of their position as well as their persons, than they were of themselves. Rand ignored Lan. His side still wanted to hunch him over, but he managed to keep erect. He was not about to show her any weakness. If you think I'll help you get that fox head away from Matt, you can think again. Somehow that medallion had stopped her channeling, or at least it had stopped her channeling from affecting Matt while he touched it. He paid a hard price for it, Moraine, and it is his. Thinking of how she had thumped his shoulders with the power, he added dryly, maybe I'll ask if I can borrow it from him. He turned away from her. There was still one he had to check on, though one way or another the urgency was gone. The Darkhounds would have done what they intended by now. Please, Rand, Moraine said, and the open pleading in her voice halted him in his tracks. He had never heard anything like that from her before. The tone seemed to offend Lan. I thought you would become a man, the warder said harshly. Is this how a man behaves? You act like an arrogant boy. Lan practiced the sword with him, and liked him, Rand thought, but if Moraine said the right word, the warder would do his best to kill him. I will not be with you forever, Moraine said urgently. Her hands gripped her skirts so hard that they trembled. I might die in the next attack. I could fall from my horse and break my neck, or take a dark friend's arrow through the heart, and death cannot be healed. I have given my entire life to the search for you, to find you and help you. You still do not know your own strength. You cannot know half of what you do. I apologize, most humbly, for any offense I have given you. Those words he had never thought to hear from her, came out as if dragged, but they came, and she could not lie. Let me help you as much as I can, while I can. Please. It's hard to trust you, Moraine. He disregarded Lan, shifting in the moonlight. His attention was all on her. You have handled me like a puppet, made me dance the way you wanted from the day we met. The only times I've been free of you were either when you were far away or when I ignored you, and you make even that hard. Her laugh was as silvery as the moon above, but bitterness tinged it. It has been more like wrestling with a bear than pulling strings on a puppet. Do you want an oath not to try manipulating you? I give it. Her voice hardened to crystal. I even swear to obey you like one of the maidens, like one of the Gaishain, if you require. But you must— Taking a deep breath, she began again more softly. I ask you, humbly, to allow me to help you. Lan was staring at her, and Rand thought his own eyes must be popping out of his head. I will accept your help, he said slowly, and I apologize, too, for all the rudeness I've shown. He had the feeling he was still being manipulated. He had had good cause to be rude when he was, but she could not lie. Tension drained from her visibly. And so she puts in practice what she describes to Egwene later on as remembering how to control Saidar, or what I call learning how to pick your battles. And RJ has Rand test her oath right away. He tells her, you're going to leave Matt alone tonight, and you are not going to try to take that ter'angreal away. It belongs to him. And while she finally says, okay, yeah, you're right, it's his, she argues that it belongs in the tower for study. Nothing in her oath says she won't argue with him. In fact, her oath is specifically to obey him like one of the maidens. RJ helpfully, just before she swears, gives us an example of how maidens obey. They ignore Rand, telling them to fuck off back to the roof and quit razzing their spear sister about teaching Matt Cawthon to sing. He calls one of them out on it, and she says, we follow your orders when it has to do with our job. Nothing about this has to do with fighting, so suck it. If Rand had required that Moraine obey him like one of the Gaishain, she wouldn't be able to argue with him, and her oath would have a lot less wriggle room than he will complain about later. We get an anecdotal observation of the oath the next day. We're in Egwene's head as everybody's packing up and getting ready to follow the Shido across the dragon wall. And Matt says to her, "He told her to be quiet, and she did," he said as she halted mist. He nodded toward Moraine and Lan, she in pale blue silk, gripping the reins of her white mare, and he in his warder's cloak, holding his great black war-horse. Lan was watching Moraine intently, expressionless as always, while she looked ready to burst with impatience as she glared at Rand. She started telling him why this is the wrong thing to do. Sounded to me like she was saying it for the 100th time, and he said, "I've decided, Moraine. Stand over there and be quiet till I have time for you." Like he expected her to do as she was told. And she did. Is that steam coming out of her ears? So this chapter, chapter 7, ends with a Moraine point of view, where she's contemplating the ter'angreal that are being left behind, including the one that is the 3 rings, the apprentice rings that all wise ones go through before they start training, and that she went through. Lan tells her that he does not like seeing her like this, and it says, "Like what?" she asked, turning her mare to join the throng. Rand and his escort were already out of the city. "Worried," he said bluntly, no readable expression on that stone-carved face now. "Afraid. I've never seen you afraid. Not when we had Trollocs and Myrtles swarming over us. Not even when you learned the Forsaken were loose and Samael was sitting almost on top of us. Is the end coming?" She gave a start and immediately wished she had not. He was looking straight ahead over his stallion's ears, but the man never missed anything. Sometimes she thought he could see a leaf fall behind his back. "Do you mean Tarmangide? A redbird in Salicen knows as well as I. The lights send not so long as any of the seals remain unbroken." The pair she had were on one of Kadir's wagons, too, each packed by itself in a cask stuffed with wool. A different wagon than the red stone door frame. She had made sure of that. "What else could I mean?" he asked slowly, still not looking at her, and making her wish she had bitten her tongue. "You have become impatient. I can remember when you would wait weeks for one tiny scrap of information, one word, without twitching a finger, but now—" He did look at her then, a blue-eyed gaze that would have intimidated most women, and most men as well. "The oath you gave to the boy, Moraine. Whatever under the light possessed you." "He has been drawing further and further away from me, Lan, and I must be close to him. He needs whatever guidance I can give, and I will do everything short of sharing his bed to see that he gets it." The rings had told her that that would be disaster. Not that she had ever considered it. The very idea still shocked her. But in the rings it was something she would or could have considered in the future. It was a measure of her growing desperation, no doubt, and in the rings she had seen that it would bring ruination on everything. She wished she could remember how. There were keys to Rand al'Thor and everything she could learn about him, but only the simple fact of calamity remained in her mind. Probably because it would have been so awkward after that he'd never call her again. But, in all seriousness, I don't know if what RJ's hinting at here is that Lanfear would have killed her in a jealous rage, which would indeed bring ruination since Rand will surely fail without Moraine's help, but which is also kind of boring. Or if he might mean that because Moraine isn't one of Rand's 3 beautiful women, some ruination would come about because the pattern would have been perverted and the dragon knocked aside from what was meant to be, which is barely more interesting. Or if it's just that the person Moraine would have to become to sexually prey on a boy with the goal to control and manipulate him, a person Moraine is so far from being that she can't even conceive of it, is someone so depraved and selfish that any counsel she gave would likely lead to ruin, for that is the sort of person who thinks by any means necessary. Rand's not wrong. The oath is totally a manipulation. He's given her a strange power over him now that he's no longer pushing her away. But in exchange, Moraine has to stop trying to sway him the moment that he tells her to shut up about it. She's forced to trust his choices, or at least to accept them, and just the assurance that she won't try to manipulate him or interfere if he orders her to stop is enough for him to want to keep her close, because he's wished he could make use of her all along, and now he needs her more than ever, because they're heading back to the wetlands, and there's a lot that Rand needs to know, and far less time to learn it than he realizes. We see them again in chapter 20, which is called Jangai Pass. RJ drops us into the scene in the middle of a lecture that Rand is barely paying attention to, as Moraine is trying to teach him about Kyriadan government and culture. It says, Moraine talked at him that way from daybreak to sunset whenever he let her. Her lectures could be on small things, details of court behavior, say, in Cairien or Saldaia or somewhere else, or on large, the political influence of the White Cloaks, or perhaps the effects of trade on rulers' decisions to go to war. It was as if she meant to see him educated, as a noble would be or should be, before he reached the other side of the mountains. It was surprising how often what she said reflected what anyone back in Emmons Field would have called simple common sense, and also how often it did not. Occasionally she came out with something startling, for instance that he should trust no woman of the Tower except herself, Egwene, Elaine, and Nynaeve, or the news that Elaida was now the Amyrlin seat. Oath to obey or no, she would not tell him how she knew that. She said it was someone else's place to tell if she chose, someone else's secret, and she could not usurp it. Rand is staring at all that cool shit that's in the mouth of the pass. There's the caduceus carved into the cliff on one side, and the city of Tan, and there's also the ruins from the breaking high up on the mountainside. So he's very distracted, and a little bit further on it says, "Are you listening to me?" Moraine said suddenly, reining her white mare closer. "You must!" She took a deep breath. "Please, Rand, there is so much that I must tell you, so much that you need to know." The hint of pleading in her tone made him glance at her. He could remember when he had been overawed by her presence. Now she seemed quite small, for all her regal manner. A fool thing that he should feel protective of her. "There is plenty of time ahead of us, Moraine," he said gently. "I don't pretend to think I know as much of the world as you. I mean to keep you close from now on." He barely realized how great a change that was from when she was keeping him close. "But I have something else on my mind right now." "Of course," she sighed. "As you wish. We have plenty of time yet." So RJ does a really good job with the tonal shift here. We haven't seen the intervening days, but the feel of their relationship is very different now. Instead of bringing that bossy, presumptuous stepmom energy, Moraine's acting like an advisor, but she's also noticeably acting as if she's running on borrowed time. And she had to have recognized the docks in her vision. She grew up in Cairien and had to have been down on that quay before, at the very least to take ship up to Tarvalon, and likely on numerous other occasions. And perhaps she was so desperate to talk him out of the crossing, in part because she needed more time, and would have preferred that they don't go into Cairien just yet, because she's got more shit to teach him. Because Rand is a decent-hearted person, even at his most contentious, he's capable of being emotionally manipulated by Moraine. And once she swears her oath, a whole new path becomes available to her precisely because their dynamic has changed from her keeping him close to him keeping her close. She's a subordinate now, one of his people and someone who deserves protection, and that softness provides an emotional in. And we're given a view into how Moraine exploits this in Chapter 30, A Wager. Rand is hanging out, chilling on a bridge, staring at a river, just before the Aiel bring in the Terran and Cairhienan soldiers under Adorian and Estian, and it says, he could waste an hour being soothed by the flow of a river. It was surely better than another night where he had to order Moraine to leave so he could study with Asmodean. She had even taken to bringing his meals to him and talking while he ate, as if she meant to cram everything she knew into his head before they reached the city of Cairhien. He could not face her begging to remain, actually begging, as she had the previous night. For a woman like Moraine, that behavior was so unnatural that he had wanted to agree simply to stop it, which was very likely why she had done it. Much better an hour listening to the quiet liquid ripplings of the river. With luck she would have given up on him for tonight. The chapter before this one is from Hadnan Kadir's perspective. It's the scene where he murders Isendra, and in it he mentions that they are most of the way across Cairhien. So Moraine knows that clock is really counting down at this point. She doesn't know how soon after they arrive in Cairhien that the news will come about Morghese, but for safety's sake has to assume basically right away. And so yeah, she's gotten desperate enough to not only bring him all his food, but to literally beg that she can stay with him. And RJ doesn't give us much more between them before we have the chapter news comes to Cairhien. We know what we need to. They're getting along better, for the most part, and she has stopped trying to divert him from his chosen path, for the most part. And off-screen, it's obvious that they have grown closer as she mentors him. and I wish that Jordan would have explored that closeness more, instead of giving us the ambivalence that accompanies Rand feeling emotionally manipulated, as he understands that somehow she's getting what she wants way more than she did before, even though the ambivalence is a natural consequence of the manipulation, and it would absolutely interfere with any closeness. It's real, but it leaves me unsatisfied. How human. Another interesting bit RJ sketches to frame the progress of their relationship is after the battle for Cairhien, as Rand and Aviendha and Asmodean are heading into the city to get the jump on High Lord Mylon's fuckery. They're riding away from the tents, heading toward the gate, and it says, Haddon and Kadir's wagons lay a mile or so from his tent, circled in a broad depression between two hills where stone dogs kept watch. A cream-colored coat straining over his bulk, the hatchet-nosed dark friend looked up, mopping his face with the inevitable large handkerchief as Rand rode past with his banner and loping escort. Moraine was there as well, examining the wagon where the door-frame ter'angreal was lashed under canvas behind the driver's seat. She did not even glance around until Kadir spoke to her. By his gestures, he was plainly suggesting that she might want to accompany Rand. In fact, he appeared eager for her to go, and small wonder. He had to be congratulating himself on keeping his being a dark friend hidden so long, but the more he was in company with an Aes Sedai, the more he was in danger of discovery. Indeed, it was a surprise to Rand that the man was still there. At least half of the drivers who had entered the waste with him had slipped away since crossing the Dragon Wall, replaced by Cairhien and refugees chosen by Rand himself to make sure they were not of Kadir's sort. He expected every morning to find the fellow himself gone too, especially since Isendra's escape. The maidens had nearly torn the wagons apart looking for the woman, while Kadir sweated his way through 3 handkerchiefs. Rand would not regret it if Kadir managed to sneak off in the night. The Aiel guards had orders to let him go, so long as he did not try to take Moraine's precious wagons. More obviously every day their loads were a treasure to her, and Rand would not see her lose them. He glanced over his shoulder, but Asmodean was staring straight ahead, ignoring the wagons altogether. He claimed to have had no contact with Kadir since Rand captured him, and Rand thought it might be true. Certainly the merchant never left his wagons, and was never out of sight of Aiel guards except when inside his own wagon. Opposite the wagons, Rand half drew rein without thinking. Surely Moraine would want to accompany him into Cairhien. She might have crammed his head full, but it always seemed there was another piece she wanted to fit in, and this once in particular he could do with her presence and advice. But she merely looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to the wagon. Frowning, he heeled the dapple on. As well to remember she had other sheep to shear than he knew about. He had become too trusting. Best to be as wary of her as of Asmodean. Trust no one, he thought bleakly. For an instant he did not know whether it was his thought or Lews Theron's, but in the end he decided it did not matter. Everybody had their own goals, their own desires, much the best to trust no one completely except himself. Yet he wondered, with another man oozing through the back of his mind, how far could he trust himself? And this is really sad, because Rand has been trusting her a lot more and wanting a relationship with her again, and so waiting for her and having her look at him for a long time and then turn away. The subtext is almost one of hurt and rejection, which he won't let himself feel, so he buries it under suspicion. Despite all that she has crammed into his head, it wasn't enough for him to realize that anywhere else she would totally have accompanied him. But here she's not an asset. The nobles would expect the Dragon Reborn to have an Aes Sedai advisor. That would have been fine. But Cairhienin would see Moraine as a Damodred first, and Rand cannot give the impression that his advisor is a Damodred. Certainly not before he gets their oaths of fealty. But Rand doesn't think about it like that. It doesn't occur to him that Moraine would be a terrible liability, and no advice she could give him would offset the damage her presence would cause. So he just assumes she's got other schemes afoot, and he feels vaguely butthurt and twists it in his head to make it about trust. And it's sad. In the last interaction RJ gives us between Moraine and Rand, before Mat brings the news about Morghese, he lays out a tableau of suspicion and contention, but ultimately trust. Rand is in a really bad mood. He's had a shitty meeting with the nobles. He's terrorized a minor lady that Colivir thrust upon him because she's trying to get a spy into his bed. And then he scares Colivir on top of that by telling her, actually, I prefer more mature company, so you'll dine with me tonight, in the hopes that'll get her to knock it off. And then Egwene and Aviendha and Moiraine come in, and we learn that he's also upset with Egwene because she's been giving him what she considers helpful information, such as that there are Aes Sedai that might be willing to support him in a cagey Aes Sedai fashion that's upsetting to him. He's mad at her for changing. He's been mad about that since Book 1, and all of his issues with Egwene will be explored in a different episode someday. Anyway, Rand is irritable and wants to know what do they want, and it says, "These came for you in the last hour," Moiraine said, extending 2 folded letters. Her voice seemed to fit Asmodean's chime-like tune. Rand rose to take them suspiciously. "If they're for me, how did they come into your hands?" One was addressed to Rand al'Thor in an exact angular hand, the other to the Lord Dragon Reborn, in script flowing yet no less precise. The seals were unbroken. A second look made him blink. The 2 seals seemed to be the same red wax, and one bore the impression of the flame of Tar-Valon, the other a tower overlaid on what he recognized as the island of Tar-Valon. "Perhaps because of where they came from," Moiraine replied, "and from whom." It was no explanation, but it was as much as he would get unless he demanded more. Even then he would have to prod her through every step. She kept her vow, but in her own way. So these are the letters from both Elaida and Alviarin. First he reads Elaida's letter, which basically tells him, "I'm sending an escort to bring you to Tar-Valon with all of the honor and respect that you deserve." It says, "She doesn't even ask," he said wryly. He remembered Elaida well for having met her only once, a woman hard enough to make Moiraine seem a kitten. The honor and respect he deserved. He would wager that the escort of Aes Sedai just happened to number 13. Passing Elaida's letter back to Moiraine, he opened the other. And then he reads Alviarin's ridiculous, flowery letter where she talks about kneeling to bask in his brilliance. And it says, he read it through again, blinking, then handed it to Moiraine. She barely scanned the page before giving it to Egwene, who had her head over the other letter with Aviendha. Perhaps Moiraine already knew what they contained? "A good thing you gave your oath," he said. "The way you used to be, keeping everything back, I might have been ready to suspect you by now. A good thing you're more open now." She did not react. "What do you make of it?" "She must have heard about your swelled head," Egwene said softly. He did not think he had been meant to hear. Shaking her head, she said more loudly, "This doesn't sound like Alviarin at all." "It is her hand," Moiraine said. "What do you make of it, Rand?" "I think there's a rift in the tower, whether Elaida knows it or not. I assume an Aes Sedai can't write a lie more easily than she can speak one." He did not wait for her nod. "If Alviarin had been less flowery, I might have thought they were working together to pull me in. I can't see Elaida even thinking half what Alviarin wrote, and I can't see her having a keeper who could write it, not if she knew." "You are not going to do this thing," Aviendha said. Elaida's letter crumpled in her hand. It was not a question. "I am not a fool." "Sometimes you are not," she said grudgingly, and made it worse by raising a questioning eyebrow to Egwene, who considered for a moment, then shrugged. "Do you see anything else?" Moiraine asked. "I see White Tower spies," he told her dryly. "They know I hold the city. For at least 2 or 3 days after the battle, the Shida would have stopped anything but a pigeon going north. Even a rider who knew where to change horses, no sure thing between Cairhien and Tar-Valon, could not have reached the tower in time for these letters to come back today." Moiraine smiled. "You learn quickly. You will do well." For a moment she almost looked fond. "What will you do about it?" "Nothing, except make sure that Elaida's escort doesn't get within a mile of me." 13 of the weakest Aes Sedai could overwhelm him linked, and he did not think Elaida would send her weakest. That, and be aware that the tower knows what I do the day after I do it. Nothing more until I know more. So that's honestly a really cool scene that nicely sums up the journey they've gone on together through the fires of heaven. He's suspicious that Moiraine gets the letters, but he reads Elaida's and then immediately passes it to her, and doesn't care that she passes it to Egwene, even though he's angry with her, and has felt throughout this book like she's working with Moiraine against him. And it's such an interesting mix of conflict and ambivalence and ultimately allyship, because in the end he understands these people are actually on my side. So here, let's all read these letters and puzzle over them together and see what we see. And then Mat shows up and delivers the news about Morgase. And Rand is ready to go kill Robin right away, and Moiraine convinces him to wait until the next day so he has a chance to cool off. And she also manages to convince him to bring some other channelers with him. And as she goes to leave, it says, "You did not try to talk me out of it," he said abruptly. "The wheel weaves as the wheel wills," was Moraine's reply. She stood in the doorway, looking more Aes Sedai than he ever remembered her, ageless, with dark eyes that seemed ready to swallow him, slight and slender, yet so regal she could have commanded a roomful of queens if she could not channel a spark. That blue stone on her forehead was catching the light again. "You will do well, Rand." And RJ just had to give her one last "wheel weaves as the wheel wills" quote before she exits the narrative for books and books. When they meet up the following morning, she gives him a couple more letters. She has one for him which weirds him out, and he indicates as much, wondering, "Why are you giving me a letter? You've never been afraid to say what you want to my face." And she has one for Tom Marilyn that says, "Yo, I'm not dead. I'm going to be trapped in Finland, and if you and Matt Cawthon and one other come and try to rescue me, you might succeed. Otherwise, I'll be stuck with the eelfin until they drain me completely of my powers and I die." Then she very calmly sets about leading them to the docks. And something would have gotten them down onto that quay, even if she weren't like, "Okay, well, I'm Moraine, and I'm metal as fuck. Today's the day. This is where it's happening, so I'm just going to saddle some horses and go down to meet it like a boss, because that's how I roll." Something would have gotten them there, even if she hadn't done that, because Lanfear shows up and skins the messenger. She skins Hadnan Kadir and blows up his wagon, and fuckery abounds. And while another lesser person might not have gone boldly to meet their fate, I'm guessing Rand would have seen what was happening and gone running down to the docks, and Moraine just going down to meet the shit show before it even starts was the best way to prevent more deaths, which is a very Moraine thing to do. She might be willing to kill innocents to protect Rand, but if she can protect Rand and innocents, that's definitely her preference. Moraine dedicated her life to Rand, not out of love or caring, but because the world depended on it, and she could look that truth in the face and not shy away, and accept the fact that it meant that she had to sacrifice everything. And not just her life in the sense of dying, or a fate worse than death, which takes far more courage, but her life in the sense of when you're riding around with your warder for 20 years looking for this kid, you don't get to have anything else. You don't get to make choices for yourself. You don't get to dream, because it's nothing but the mission. And even if her devotion to Rand was not rooted in love or caring, it does seem that she did grow fond, and she was very proud of him. Very proud of what he managed to learn once he let her teach him. And she likely kicked herself for taking so long to realize that she needed to pick her battles, let go of that presumptuous stepmom energy, and accept a relationship on his terms. And the fact that she didn't get to teach him nearly as much as she'd hoped to is entirely her own fault. But it's Rand's fault, too, as she points out in her letter to him, because she knew that this is how it would be. There were 3 paths she was shown, one where he died, one where he lived and loved Lanfear, and the good one. And if she could have told him about it and impressed upon him why she was so determined to cram his head full of things, she'd have left him better prepared. But because our dragon has a terrible personality flaw, she couldn't. It says, "I could not tell you for the same reason I could not tell Lan. Even given the choices, I could not be sure which you would pick. Men of the 2 rivers, it seems, retain much of storied Manetherin in them, traits shared with men of the borderlands. It is said that a borderlander will take a dagger's wound to avoid harm to a woman, and count it fair trade. I dared not risk that you would place my life above your own, certain that somehow you could sidestep fate. Not a risk, I fear, but a foolish certainty, as today has surely proved." "My choice, Moraine," he muttered. "It was my choice. A few final points. If Lan has not already gone, tell him that what I did to him I did for the best. He will understand one day, and, I hope, bless me for it. Trust no woman fully who is now Aes Sedai. I do not speak simply of the Black Aja, though you must always be watchful for them. Be as suspicious of Varen as you are of Alviarin. We have made the world dance as we sang for 3,000 years. That is a difficult habit to break, as I have learned while dancing to your song. You must dance free, and even the best intentioned of my sisters may well try to guide your steps as I once did. Please deliver Tom Marilyn's letter safely when you meet him again. There is a small matter that I once told him of, which I must make clear for his peace of mind. Lastly, be wary, too, of Master Jason Natale. I cannot approve wholly, but I understand. Perhaps it was the only way. Yet be careful of him. He is the same man now that he always was. Remember that always. May the light illumine and protect you. You will do well. It was signed simply Moraine. She had almost never used her house name. He reread the second last paragraph again closely. Somehow she had known who Asmodean was. It had to be that. Known that one of the Forsaken was right there in front of her and never blinked once. She had known why, too, if he read it right. He would have thought in a letter that would go blank when he set it down she could have come right out and said what she meant. Not just concerning Asmodean, about how she had learned what she had in Reudian, something to do with wise ones, or he missed his guess, and as much chance of finding out more from the letter as from them. About Aes Sedai. Was there a reason she mentioned Varen? And why Alviarin instead of Elida? Even about Tom and Lan. For some reason, he did not think she had left a letter for Lan. The warder was not the only one who believed in clean wounds. He almost took Tom's letter out and opened it, but she might have warded it the same way she had his. Aes Sedai and Cairhien, and she had wrapped herself in mystery and manipulation to the end. To the end. That was what he was trying to avoid with all this blather about her keeping secrets. She had known what would happen, and come as bravely as any Aiel. Come to her death knowing it waited. She had died because he could not bring himself to kill Lanfear. He could not kill one woman, so another died. His eyes fell on the last words. You will do well. They cut like a cold razor. And I've expressed before that I wish RJ had Rand learn from this, and come out of this experience determined to never again let whether an enemy has tits impede his ability to lay waste. Or if he weren't going to learn, have it be less about a good woman died because he couldn't kill an evil one, and more about Moraine the person, about how she had grown to matter to him, and how he struggled with her gone. But the subtext is certainly there, for Rand is aimless and anguished throughout Lord of Chaos. For all the conflict and ambivalence in their relationship, and how fragile the bond between them seemed from the moment she declared its existence in Book 1. Without her, the dragon seems lost. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Podcast of the Dragon. If you're wondering where I've been, I went back to school last fall. Then I wasn't feeling this episode for a long time, thanks to the show's representation of the relationship between Moraine and Rand satisfying me in a way that the books never has. Unlike RJ, Rafe Judkins wants to destroy our souls when Rand's mentor hurtles through that doorway, so it took a while for me to want to do this exploration of Rand and Moraine's relationship in the books. I'm glad I gave it the time it needed because I came away with a much deeper appreciation of what RJ gave us, and I saw things that I'd never seen before. I have no idea when I'll have another episode, but when I do, it will be covering New Spring. I'd like to have one out before WotCon in July, but that might be ambitious. I've shut down Patreon because my content is so intermittent, but there are links in the show notes for Discord and my email and to my Twitter handle @PodOfTheDragon. I refuse to call it X. There's also a link to Apple Podcasts. If you could go and review me either there or on whatever platform you're listening on, I'd really appreciate it. And if you know anyone who likes The Wheel of Time and might be interested in a different kind of podcast, please tell them about me. My music is by Kevin MacLeod. My name is Morgan, and I'm not down with asshole stepmom energy. I prefer to bring the cool aunt vibe and cheerlead teenage rebellion.